usually like to begin by just showing a video, because this video is a 7 minutes video that in a way speaks. It's as if I'm talking, but at least you see the video.
مفيش حاجة تيجي كده انت حبيبي كده ترجع زي زمان يا ابني اسمعني حتى دلعني تاخد عقلي كمان حبيبي قرب بصي 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 زعلان ازعل ازعل نصي نص احسن ابعد ابعد ونص هتبقى انت اكيد خسران مفيش حاجة تيجي كده انت حبيبي
This is an old piece, but I always like to begin with it because it kind of reflects a way of thinking, but also a certain dynamic at that time. I'm talking from around 2007. And at that time I had just arrived from Lebanon and to study art in the Netherlands. And they were all the time asking me, or like, I think at that time it was the first time in Documenta some artists from Lebanon were presented, probably by Catherine David. And so everyone was expecting that we do something about the war. But actually, so the artists who were then showing were colleagues and friends of mine, but they are like 10, 15 years older. And we are people who were born in the war and then we grew up in it. So for us it was very important not to talk about the war, because this is one of the ways that you can survive, is by not talking about the war if you live in it. So for me this was kind of a video that I made as a reaction also to when I just came to the Netherlands and people were asking me, can't you talk about the war, as if this was like what I had to do. But it's also a very different mindset, because as you all know, and we're just mentioning it in the previous talk, from 2011 on, some big changes occurred in the Arab world. And I myself, I'm half Syrian, so my mom comes from Damascus, and we used to escape to Syria during our civil war, which today we call it as a starter, mezza, starters, for the war in Syria. But in fact, so from 2011 on, things changed. For those who have grown up in the war, to see the war again was really something like really, in a way, I mean, you sometimes ask yourself, how many wars shall I live, you know? And you always expect when you live a war that one more will come, and then one more, and then one more. So, but as I'm always trying to not look at the drama and dramatize, because this is what you will always see, of course. And in 2011, I was in Beirut when the revolution started in Syria. It began, it was like a snowball from Egypt to coming to Syria, and then for us this was like really big, because actually, if you perhaps also know that these two countries' histories are very intermingled, and some 100 years ago it was called the Great Syria, all those countries. And in the civil war, Syria, the Syrian army, was a big player in our civil war. And so then when the Syrian war started, of course a lot of people had to escape, including my family members, from wherever they were living in Syria to Lebanon. So being in Beirut was, in a way, kind of witnessing directly the war, but you're not in it, you're right on the edge, but you can see everything what's happening. Because what happens, people come in their cars, for instance. On the car signs, for instance, if someone is escaping from Daraa, this is where the first revolution started, or from Hama, or from Damascus. Every town has it's written the name of that town on the car signs, and people are escaping in their cars. And you can imagine, just a few hours ago they drove, it's like driving from here to Zagreb maybe, what they've been through before they escaped there. And in my childhood this was what we did, we escaped in the car to Damascus. So it was also something really strong to see the reverse happening. And at that time I was myself pregnant, and so I was about to give birth. And I was thinking, well, usually you imagine you give birth to a child, whatever, to a better place, but things were not like that. Well, in the beginning, there was a lot of hope. And also what was amazing in Beirut is that because people escaped from everywhere, in the same street, you would see, well, where my studio was situated is a neighborhood that was also, in the war I wouldn't have been able to live there, but now all the artists want to live there, and I'm living there too. So you would see a lot of the young people, activists, artists who escaped, who were in danger and came from Syria to Lebanon. So in the same street you would see people from so different places mingling and mixing again. So at the same time, Beirut was again very rich culturally. And also Beirut has always been a place like that. I mean, when the Palestinians had to escape Palestine, huge numbers came to Lebanon, and this also enriched the texture. And ironically speaking, also at the time, the Yarmouk camp was bombed, which is a Palestinian camp in Syria. I mean, you know the situation when the Palestinians were kicked out. They were scattered in those Arab worlds between Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. They are not granted passports at all. They are just like mushrooms. They use them in camps. They grant them, they can live, but they can't obtain Lebanese or Syrian or whatever passports unless they are rich. Of course, if you're rich, you can get everything. And sometimes even you're very rich, but you can't. But if there are certain reasons behind also. But why am I drifting too much? So the idea is that, well, all this, you know, I've lived in the war of 78, 84, and so on, and I've witnessed the Palestinian massacre as well in 82. So it's also quite strong to see how the Palestinians who left from Syria, from the Yarmouk camp, for instance, and they came to an uncle or a cousin of an uncle or someone who lives in a Palestinian camp in Lebanon. Everyone's thinking it's going to be 1 week to 6 months, we get rid of that whatever, we're not going to say who, I mean, of course, you all know who, not going to use bad words now. And then life will be we go back to home. But no, things lasted, and until today, we don't know. I mean, he's still in his chair. So at that time, the irony was less, I mean, the trauma was again very big, and the crisis, the witness of the crisis is in your face. Just like the footage she was showing, which is quite amazing, of people in any means trying to escape in your own country. So what do you do? Do you stand still? What do you do? This was a question I kept on asking myself for a year, until once I read an interview with a Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, who was talking about that in particular, that when you live in a place with those conditions around you, the only thing you can do is to talk about them, because that's what you see around you. And so then I was like, yeah, I mean, if I don't do anything, I'd be also lying to myself. I mean, I have to get involved. And so then what I started to do is to invite people who just came to my neighborhood, to my studio, and I made their portraits, and I wrote down our conversations. And for me, it's also a way to capture my own Syria, because I know Syria from not Bashar al-Assad, but Hafiz al-Assad's days. This is when we used to go and stay there. We went less and less after the 90s. So for me also, it was a way to recapture my own Syria through meeting with those people, but also you know, we spoke about everything. And this was one of the problems we lived through after the Lebanese civil war, because there has been not enough written, and I mean, until today, for instance, in the schools, there's no history book to recall that. So the generation of my sister and the younger ones, they really don't know what has happened. And to the scale of Lebanon, it's not too big like here, but a little bit maybe bigger, because it's overpopulated. We are 4 million about. So to that scale, the war we had was quite something. But then, so the Syrian war came, and it has been one of the most documented wars. I mean, the only first maybe documented war. People were shooting themselves, posting it on YouTube while they were dying. So there was a lot of things happening, and at the time in Beirut, there were Syrians, there were Iraqis, there were the Palestinians who escaped from Syria, and the ground was also boiling again. But to me, it made it very vibrant. And when I decided to draw people, for me was, in a way, also to capture the energy of this revolution, because we really believed something will change. And then from 2015 on, we understood that, in fact, no, and also a lot of those who took part in every part of the fight did mistakes like every war. I mean, but for me, I have the perspective of someone who has lived a war before from the same area. So it's really ironical to see how this causes that the people get really, fall apart like a whole society. But anyway, I mean, living under a dictator, I don't know what. I mean, we've seen the consequences as well. So, not to talk too much, I already talked too much. So, what should I show things or?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So after this Rawan song, which is more playful, able to be playful, I did a video where I questioned if I have to do something and how. Maybe I can show a part of it, and then I can talk of those works, and then we open the discussion. But so the drawings I made were just really simple sketches, and I was thinking, if I do that, I don't want to take any images. No, it's okay, I can open it. Instead, I want to draw, because a drawing is never really realistic. And also to give time to draw and sit with someone, and also as opposed to the revolution itself. When you are in it, you are filming. You don't need someone to film you. It's just like that train image that they are filming themselves as they are. And this is, I think, also the iPhone, all those means that we have today, that also provoked revolutions in a way, and were sometimes criticized. So for me, I got back to the older means, which is just drawing. And in fact, it really allows me to spend more time with each person. And the persons, everyone who comes to your studio, they really appreciate it. It's really like a magical, I mean, so many people said, oh, I've never been drawn by anyone. But for me, it's about the drawing, but also the story. It's like I'm collecting a well of stories. For instance, this is a Kurdish woman who's from Kobani, and who's at that time was coming, and I think by now she left to Canada. This is a young girl who says, I don't put anything on Facebook. My father is pro-regime. A lot of young people are like that. They escape on their own. The parents are pro-Assad. They stay at home. They're too old to move. and the young people go on the road. And she's been to Beirut, and then from 2015 on, a lot of those people understood that Beirut is not welcoming, and they started to come to you. This is when you see people coming here in that side, because they understood the piège, the trap to stay in the Arab world. They're all the time asked for money to renew their visas, they're put in jails, they're like abused, they ask them amounts of money for horrible houses, so much money, you know. So they're all the time drained, and after a few years you understand, okay, I have to move on. And so then people started to come to Europe. That's one guy whose son was taken by the Islamists in Aleppo. It was also before the Aleppo was in the news. And he used to have a shop, and now he's taking care of an antique shop, working for someone in Lebanon. This is a friend, and he was for 8 years, actually before the revolution, he was for 8 years in Saidnaya. I don't know, you must have heard of it. It's one of the most extreme jails in Syria. And he also witnessed how the regime jails Islamists, and then when they need it, they put them out of jail, and they use it, you know, they use them as fire. So he was in jail with Islamists, and then he was there when they put them out and they triggered a war somewhere. And that's one of the tools for the regime to say, do you want us or do you want Islamists? You choose. So then everyone, okay, you stay. This is one young boy who went on his own to sell flowers in Beirut, and he doesn't want to go to school. And also schooling is an issue. A lot of people who come from more rural parts, they don't want to go to school. They're not even, it's not in their agenda, even if they'd stay in Syria. The boys would go until they're 12, maybe, I don't know. And then it's finished, they work, they have to work, earn money. This is a girl who lived in Syria for 8 years. She's French herself, but she had her life there, and also she was obliged to exit just like everyone else. And so that's also a family from Aleppo. They came very early to Lebanon, before the Aleppo that you heard in the news, because he's an amazing doctor, the man, and he's one of the few who were accepted to work at the American University of Beirut. And he's a poet too, and then he came with his family, his wife and her sister, and so on. And it's amazing to see how they are now part of the Lebanese cultural texture. That's one guy who told me to draw him big mustache because he's a hairdresser, and he told me how he used to cut people like a peasant's haircut. Another young boy. This is one of the boys who left from Yarmouk camp to Sabra Shatila, but he couldn't bring his family, and it's still cheaper if his family lives in Syria because schools are very expensive in Lebanon, and you have to learn French and so on, so it's not so easy to bring your family all the time. And not other kids, and so. Okay, so for now I've made some. This is one guy, like about 300-400 drawings, and I would continue. But it doesn't matter. I mean, it's something you do quickly. But so this is one of the guys who also came through here, through the Balkans to Holland, and he also recounted all the stories. For instance, there's a famous apple somewhere. There's a famous field of apples, and he explained how he went through it, and his friend was allergic and so on. There's all these adventures, but at the same time they were so happy telling those adventures, you know. I met, for instance, one woman. She said, I don't know how I got the strength. I walked, my daughter with me, we walked through, she counted all the countries, Slovenia, and she told me, I was telling my daughter all the time, at the end of the road, your cousin is there. And then each time I told her this, the girl would get the strength and walk again and walk again. But she also said, one of the few, she said, I mean, this is an adventure. I've never had such an adventure in my life, and I actually don't regret it. It's crazy. This is a little bit how I showed it in Documenta in Kassel. So it was on a shelf, and you could see the drawings. And each time I change, I don't hang them in any chronological order or anything. I just, deal with the image and put it. And then next to that, there is a book with all the translated stories, but you don't. The story is not put next to the face, so you don't know who said what. And I feel always, even if the people said, yeah, you can do whatever you want, I feel always I want to protect, and I change the names and so on. Do we have still time, or we can? Okay, so I can speak also then of those paintings, because I studied painting in Bejrutu for 4 years at the Lebanese university, also like a very interesting place, because of the Lebanese civil war, which we had. It was divided between Christians, Muslims, supposedly, and then even the university, who was in the center, which was the Green Line, was divided. And so there was a university for the arts for the Christian people and the university for the art for the Muslims, supposedly. And the same model would go to the Christian part. She would get naked and they draw her. She comes to us. She stays dressed, and we have to draw her like that. Yeah, but so anyway, so my relationship to painting is really like a big question mark, and I'm painting at the same time I'm questioning what I'm doing all the time because of many factors, but also because in Bejrutu when we studied painting there was no museum that you can look at. So we were looking at paintings of Van Gogh in a yellow-paged book that survived from 1972 and etc. And they take it so seriously. It's always those men artists that we have to learn about and copy and so on. So for me, painting is also about, for instance, here I use really bad quality canvas. It's almost like plastic. And I cut it out, and it's just charcoal. It's really bad. But so it came from the fact that when you walk around in Beirut, the minute you go out of your house, you see in every neighborhood there are pictures of politicians hanging. And so it's kind of a way to mark, we are here, we are controlling that area, and there's no way, no one else has to put it. It's like a really old-fashioned way. The same, for instance, in Syria, but it's always Assad and his son and so on. So for us, no, it's more textured. Every neighborhood has a few bunch of guys. And Assad, you will find him also in the southern suburb of Lebanon. The pro-Hezbollah areas, Assad is everywhere anyway. So you won't miss him. And so I try to deal with those images that they bombard you the minute you exit your house. And I said, well, I can't remove them. They are in my unconscious. So what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try to make something funny and create funny stories out of their images, faces, whatever. So for each bunch of politicians, I imagine a story. For instance, for him, he's one of the Christian, actually, cardinals or something. I imagine that he went to Venice and he did a performance. And the performance consists that suddenly he has to look to the same point, but no one will realize. It will be a very subtle performance, something like that. I mean, those two guys, Ahmadinejad, at the time he was president of Iran, and Hassan Nasrallah, still the leader of Hezbollah. So Ahmadinejad invited Hassan Nasrallah to Iran. The minute he arrives to the airport, he takes him to the Contemporary Museum of Art in Tehran, which actually really has paintings by Francis Bacon, but it's brought to the collection from the Shah times, of course, because they were also allies with England and blah, blah. So, but then, he takes him there, and they're both looking at painting by Francis Bacon, and they have a very deep conversation, criticizing or analyzing the composition. Then there's this Hariri. He came to Lebanon. They say he made his money in Saudi Arabia and so on, and then he came after the war to Lebanon, and he rebuilt it, but he also stole it, of course. He stole everything and rebuilt it. And before they assassinated him, and they say the Syrians assassinated him. But anyway, in this story, he supposedly wants to teach his son to paint like Willem de Koning. And it's at the end of the workshop, they have to take flowers to Willem de Koning and thank him and so on. And the last one is from Nabih Berri, who's until now the same spokesman in the Lebanese parliament, until now. And he has so many plastic surgeries, a bit like Berlusconi style, with his wife. And he wants to buy her, she has a dinner in 2 weeks, she invited friends, and she wants to buy 12 chairs of the Rietveld chair, the Dutch Rietveld. But she wants to paint them in gold. So they are having a conversation about if they're gonna buy them or not. So these are my imagined paintings.